Malcolm Gladwell, you are sitting here and you are such a special, unique human. I don't even understand how you're so prolific. I don't, but I feel like this is like Christmas and my birthday that you're sitting here. Thank you.
You're very kind. I'm happy to be on the show.
I love you. Everybody loves you. All right. So I want to get into it because there's just so much. I actually can't believe one person has put out this much wisdom in your short amount of time you've been on the planet. But before we go there, I kind of want to know a little bit about you. And I'm just curious, tell me a little bit about you as a kid. Was there any inkling that you were super curious or that like you looked at the world differently, you asked different kinds of questions, and one day maybe you do this kind of work? Like, what was the seed of this for you?
Oh, my mom had 3 sons and I was the third. And she says that I amused myself. She would leave me in my crib for hours by myself and I would be fine. So I don't know what that means, but that's one thing maybe. And I'm a lot like my father was he sadly died 3 years ago, but he was a man of great mischief. And he really took delight in the world and all of he was an eccentric Englishman. And he just, he never saw anything entirely in a straightforward manner. Everything was so I just kind of have taken after the great example of Graham Gladwell. I think that's my best. He was a mathematician who, he's your classic absent-minded professor, but he was incredibly modest. So once you were outside of math, I always say about my dad, he knew 3 things. He was an expert in 3 things: mathematics, gardening, and the Bible. And on everything else, he was open to suggestion. So he was like, he didn't feel like he had a one-up on. One of his best friends was my dad had a PhD in whatever. One of his best friends was a guy who dropped out of high school our neighbor who dropped out of high school in like 5th grade.
Yep.
They would have these wonderful conversations because that was sort of the way my father operated. Anyway, I hope I take after him.
So that makes so much sense because right before we started recording, I said the thing that makes me most intimidated about you is you, because you treat everybody, you have so much humility, and that makes sense. Like, that's his legacy. You are so that kind of person. That's the sweetest thing that you want to be, because you are, by every standard, like one of the smartest people that's walking the earth, and you don't act like you're better than anybody.
I would quarrel with the first, but not with the second of those claims.
So that's so beautiful that we got to hear a little bit about your dad. I'm sure he was so stinking proud of you. I can't even imagine being your parent and what that feels like. It's like, oh my God, again, another one, that too. Okay, so then going forward in your childhood, I read that this was surprising, that you like didn't get into like the best graduate schools. And then you started pursuing advertising and you got a bunch of rejection. And I'm like, no, that doesn't make sense. So tell us about that period of time and how you dealt with that.
Oh, well, I'm not, I had very specific interests in college. So I did very well in things I was interested in and not very well. And I didn't really go to class because I thought so there were real limitations on how well I could do, which I accepted. I never thought of, I tried to get a job in advertising, and failed. I think I applied to 20 different agencies.
Oh my
got
God.
20, but I didn't strike me as a judgment against me. I just figured, maybe, I don't know what I thought. I was very untroubled by these. When I was 20 when I graduated from college, and I sort of felt like nothing matters for a while. And I still think that's the right attitude. I was like, there's an infinite number of things I can do. I'll probably like most of them.
Yeah.
This was one idea, but I don't know, it didn't work out. And I had other ideas, and, I just kept on pursuing things until, but at 20, one of the things that breaks my heart about young people sometimes is when they do think their entire future hinges on the decisions
Yeah.
they make when they're 20.
Yep.
And it just doesn't.
Yeah.
It really doesn't.
And that also really speaks to the same theme of humility, because you don't hang your identity on getting this job or getting into this school. That makes sense why, you have so many accolades and it's still like, oh, good, great. Like you're just very much going back to the kid in the crib, is like, everything is a wonder and it's all kind of fun and you're just kind of happy to be here. That's so beautiful that you're not attached. I think so many of us are attached, that our identity, we live and die by a rejection, and you don't.
Well, rule number one of a happy life is don't read your Twitter mentions. It's along the same lines. Like, why, I'm always mystified. Sometimes I feel like people, they describe some traumatic experience they've had online. And my thought is always, well, you don't have to read your Twitter mentions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you could make a simple choice just to
Right.
focus on, what your friends say about you, people you love say about you, and what you're doing. And like what some random dude in his basement thinks about you is, why would you spend any time worrying about that?
That's amazing. But like, how do you not, after you write your first New York Times bestselling book and it's a smash success, how do you not feel like, oh, this has to also be that, and if it doesn't, I'm going to feel like a loser? Like, how do you not get caught up in that? I mean, the way you don't is because you do it again every time. That's the thing. That's your trick, is you just keep getting the same degree of success. But it doesn't seem like you are being sort of pulled by that as like, oh, if it doesn't, happen, I'm going to be destroyed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not immune to the normal anxiety people have about how well the world is going to receive what they do. But I think the key is, if you can extract, like, it's important that the process be fun and meaningful. And if the process is fun and meaningful, or the process of getting to a completed podcast or book or whatever, then if it's a disappointment in its reception, you haven't lost. Because like I think of, when I do a creative project, I think of it as like 80-20. 80% of the fun is making it. 20% of the fun is how the world receives it. And so it hurts if the world doesn't like it, but I still have the 80%.
Yeah.
So I spend my time trying to fix the 80% part. That's what I can control. Like tomorrow, I'm going to name drop. Tomorrow, I'm going to Washington, D.C. to interview the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. For long, complicated reasons, I'm really into the Air Force right now.
It's like a normal day. Yeah. Yep.
And like, for a project, I don't know how the project will be received by the world, but what I know is this guy who's insanely cool, and who said to me when I was setting up the interview, he goes, "Son, we got to get you airborne." And like, I don't know, but I'm totally fascinated with planes. And the idea of going up in a fighter jet is like, literally, this is the best thing that's ever happened to me in my entire life. So like, I have that regardless
It's awesome.
of what happens to the book when it's done.
Yeah.
I had this experience. It's going to be fantastic.
Yeah. And by the way, that is one of the secrets to your success, I believe, because when I talk to people, like my husband also, like me, is obsessed with you, obsessed. And I say, why do you love him? He goes, he's so enthusiastic that whatever topic he's talking about, he goes, he did this thing on country clubs. And like, why did country clubs he goes, I'm obsessed now with country clubs. He goes, I could care less about country clubs, but he talking about, I took a class at UCLA, which said that enthusiasm lights up so strongly in the brain. And that's what you do, is everything is fascinating through your eyes. And then the world is glued. It's like whatever Malcolm loves, now everybody's into it because that's so infectious. So I love that. Again, that makes sense, because you're like, I just love what I'm doing. And then that's kind of what makes it work. Okay. So talking about your work, a couple things. There's so much of your work, but we're going to just ask a few questions. So the first book I read of yours was, of course, The Tipping Point. And I remember being like, oh my God, this is so brilliant. So my audience is always asking that question. Like, what does it take for something to catch fire? What everyone wants to know, how does my piece of content go viral? And you explain it so well. So on one foot, like, what does that mean? What is a tipping point? How do we get to that? And how can we sort of walk toward it? Is there anything that we can do to try to make that happen?
There's some things you can do. I mean, the book was meant to be a kind of partial guide to that process, But at the same time, we have to understand that this process is, to some extent, completely out of our hands. And lots of things, which is really an important point, because when something hits, you have to, if you're the person whose thing hits, you have to appreciate that you were only partially responsible for that hit.
Yeah.
The world took over. You know, I've been doing this project with the singer Paul Simon, and he has this lovely riff about how popularity in music is a river. And sometimes you're riding with the current and sometimes you're not. And it's nothing to do with you. Like, you know, you're either some portion of your career, you're in the thick of things and everything's a hit, and you may continue to make beautiful, amazing music, but the river has flowed on without you. I thought that's so I think that's the first thing. But the second thing, that book was a lot about the idea of social power, the kind of power that resides outside of hierarchies and money. And that's I feel like since I wrote that book, the world has kind of really embraced that notion. But that idea that there's power that comes from economic status, there's power that comes from political status, there's power that comes from institutional status, but that's not all. There is also a whole other realm of things that comes out of relationships and the authenticity that people have in the world and the power of their friendships and the beauty of their ideas. I mean, look at how Black Lives Matter, has now stands at the center of our conversation about policing. I have written endlessly about policing and police violence over the years. I take Black Lives Matter very seriously. I can't tell you who's running Black Lives Matter. I mean, I know the names of some of the people who are, but I don't have an understanding. I can't tell you where they're based, how big their budget is, none of that matters. What matters is that the idea that they represent is now at the center of our discourse. That to me is a beautiful example of what I was trying to get at in the tipping point.
100%. And I was going to talk about it with you later, but it is fascinating that Talking to Strangers came out before this moment. And you were right there. I mean, you were there a year ago. Like, this was at the front. Anyone who read that book must have been like, oh, he was so on this topic. It was like, and then again, it just becomes like a tipping point. It's kind of amazing what happened with George Floyd, how that like broke everything open. So what makes that happen? What are you saying that made that happen? Was it people posting that and why that and not Talking to Strangers? Or was it a buildup of all of those things and in continuum?
I think there was a buildup. I think that those cases, that string of cases, high profile cases that happened beginning with Michael Brown and Ferguson, set the stage and pushed us a lot closer to the point where we were going to take this. I don't think George Floyd has the impact that it does if we hadn't have had
the lead up,
those 10 cases in 2014, 15, 16. And I also think that, you know, we didn't have a lot of distractions, right? We weren't at work. We were at home. We were online. We had a chance. It's usually so easy for us to dismiss even the most pressing things because we got to go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, or we got to.
So interesting. I never thought that.
I think that extended period of lockdown that we're in allowed us to focus.
Wow. That's fascinating. Okay. So you have so much amazing wisdom. Another thing that comes up on the show all the time, I would say the number one thing that is in the way for people is overthinking. Really, like they want to publish this podcast, this book, they want to start an Etsy shop, they want to text this person, and they just get stuck. And in Blink, which is one of my favorite books, that's how I got introduced to John Gottman, who I wound up, he became like such a help in our marriage. Like, you're just amazing what you've given to the world. How do you help people make decisions? Like, let's talk about that. Like, when you want to overthink it, what have you learned is helpful in clarifying what we should do so we don't get stuck?
Well, in one of my, it's funny, there's a guy named Albert O. Hirschman, who is this legendary economist, one of the great economists of the 20th century. And he had this phrase he used called Hamlet was wrong. Hamlet was wrong was the motto of his life. And by that, he meant that Hamlet was someone who couldn't make a decision, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. The fact that he didn't know what was coming paralyzed him. And Hirschman's big point was that Hamlet had it backwards, that once you accept the fact you can't know the future, that the world is inherently unpredictable, that shouldn't freeze you. It should free you up, because all of a sudden there are no consequences to making. There's no such thing as the wrong decision, right? Once you accept the fact that I don't know what's going to happen I don't know whether I'm going to take this job or not, would like this job or not. I don't know whether my business is going to be a success or a failure. You can pretend you know, but every time you look at the world, you realize that half of the stuff that happens is totally a surprise to everyone and completely unpredictable in retrospect. So Hirschman's big point was Hamlet's wrong. The unpredictability of the world means you're free to do whatever you want, right? And it's funny, we were talking about my dad before. My dad was a Hamlet is wrong guy. And at his funeral, my eulogy was all about Hamlet is wrong and how that was the thing that guided every significant decision in his life. He married my mother, a Black woman, in 1959. And if he had been Hamlet, he wouldn't have married her. He would have said, I don't know, is it the right thing? What's the world going to think? Am I going to be able to live where I want to live? My kid's going to be the victim of racism, blah, blah, blah. My dad was like, I don't know what's going to happen. I love the woman. I'm going to marry her. And he married her. And they had a wonderful, he was that sort of person. And I think I've been thinking a lot about Hamlet is wrong recently. And it's such a freeing notion, like at a certain point, you just have to accept the fact that this belief we have that the future is knowable is crazy. If we had this conversation 5 months ago, 6 months ago, and I had said to you, the entire world is going to stop functioning for 4 months, you would have said, Malcolm, you're insane, right? Nobody knew this. Nobody knew, and none of this. So it's like, stop. I think people need to have the freedom to take more chances is the way I would.
Yeah, that's so beautiful that you really got that lesson from your dad, so much so that you spoke about that in his passing. That's incredible. And look what it did. You're here because of that in 1959. Yeah, no, definitely. It's amazing. I mean, the ripple effects of that. Mm-hmm. I think the reason people don't want to make those choices is because it seems as though we're all trying to avoid pain. Like every time I get into it with people, it's like by the age of 9 or 12, someone walked out, someone died, someone rejected them. And then there's this, I'm going to spend my whole life strategizing around like not being in pain. Like, I don't want to fail. I don't want to. So that's part of it is we have to, I guess, be up for that, right? Like we might get hurt. Yeah. And that's hard for people. They want to have a certainty that that's not going to happen.
There's a beautiful idea, though, in psychology called affective forecasting, which is this idea that the thing we are worst at forecasting are our emotional reactions to events. So we tend to systematically overestimate how happy good news will make us, and also overestimate how unhappy bad news will make us, right? So you think if you win the lottery, it's going to change your life. Actually, it doesn't. Mm-hmm. You also think, like I don't know why we're talking about my dad, but in the week after my father's death, I would have said, I will never get over this. Yeah. I did. It doesn't mean I didn't care for him. It just means that I found a way to, so it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. And at the same time, the success of my books, for example, does not make my life as better as I thought it might. It's just a kind of thing, so I think knowing that also should free people up to make sort of radical choices.
Oh my God, that's so huge. Yeah, that's so huge. And what do you think about that immediate decision, that gut feeling? Because especially in what's happened over the last few months, I feel like people's gut feelings are sometimes very wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
But often they're very right. And reading Blink, I was like, oh my God, it's so true. Within 4 seconds, I like know what I really feel about this person or this idea. Like there's a feeling. How do we know to trust that? What if it is fear? Like, how do you know which one, how do you know how to discern that?
I don't think trust is the right word. I think you should take that feeling seriously and think about it. It's not that it's always accurate, but it does represent some bit of information about your own state at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
So, to give an example, you're walking down the street, you're a white woman walking down a street, and you see a large young black man approaching you. You may have a sudden stab of fear. Oh my God, what's going to happen? Right? That's not something to trust.
Right.
It's something to interrogate. You should ask yourself, now, why am I having this feeling? Is this a representation of some hint of prejudice in my heart that I need to confront? Right? Why is my response to this situation rational? Would I feel the same way if this person were white? Is it 3:00 in the morning in the worst neighborhood in the world, in which case anyone approaching you is a problem? Or am I walking down Rodeo Drive at 2:00 in the afternoon, in which case I should chill, right? So take it seriously, but just investigate it. That's why I think that's what our function. If you meet someone on a date and you're powerfully attracted to them, it doesn't mean you should marry them, but it does mean you should think seriously about that person. Right? It's not trivial if you have that feeling.
Yeah. Okay. So another really, probably one of the biggest topics on this show is like what makes people successful. Like we've had all these millionaires, billionaires, successful authors here trying to unpack this. And Outliers is one of the best books I ever read. I'm sure most people who read it feel the same way. And I've learned so much. I quote it constantly. For those people who haven't read it, or even if they have, what was your biggest takeaway from that? From looking at what makes people high achieving and what we can learn from that if we want to have success?
I guess it was how much it was the advantages that propel us are very often things we're not focused on. So we tend to focus a lot on our own innate gifts and not enough about our position in society, chance things about the era, the generation we're born into, the unexpected opportunities given by our age cohort or whatever. I tried to identify stuff, like I have a chapter on airplane crashes, and the success of a pilot is powerfully bound up in the culture that pilot belongs to, right? Nothing to do with you. Your national culture affects the way you make decisions in times of stress. And if you want to make better pilots and you're from one of those countries that has a problem, you have to address that issue. That's I just wanted people to broaden the list. If I ask you, why are you successful? I want you to give me 10 reasons, not 2. That's really what that book was saying. 10 reasons, not 2. And when you come up with 10 reasons, you will discover that you have a far more humbling account of your own rise than you do if you only have 2.
Yeah. I have a very good friend who you kind of made his whole life because he wrote you a letter and you actually wrote him back. And he couldn't believe it. So he's a TV writer. He created Third Rock from the Sun and a bunch of other shows.
Oh, wow.
And he loves you. And he wrote you about Outliers. He said there's a Jewish word called mazel, which stands for Makom Zman Lasod. Mazel. It's like an acronym. Yeah. And he's like, that's your whole book. It's like right place, right time, but you have to have done the work so that when you're in there, and he said, you actually wrote back and you were like, I never write any, I don't have the time, but you're so right. That's crazy. And he like framed it. He's like, you wrote me back. Oh my God. And when people say mazel tov, they don't know what it means. They think it means good luck, but what it means is may you be at the right place in the right time and may you have done the work. So when you're in the right place at the right time, the opportunity. And that was so amazing about your book. You're like, yeah, let's talk about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Yeah, let's talk about the Beatles. Let's talk about what they had already done and then where they were. And people don't get it. They think it's all just like, you're the most talented person in the world. And I feel like if my memory serves, I read it when it came out, but you talked about kids who can talk to grownups, right? Like kids who have the ability. And I was like, when I was a kid, if I missed an orthodontist appointment, my mom would make me call the orthodontist at 9 and say, I'm sorry, I missed the appointment. I overslept. And I always felt like that helped me so much. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because I feel like so much in being successful is how you have that confidence to talk to people. I thought that was a really interesting point.
Yeah, that notion that, that was a part of the book where I was interested in these kinds of, what are some of the subtle things that that parents do that help their children, that advance the cause of their children. And that was a big part of it, that we overlook the extent to which sometimes that these kinds of social gifts that you use to navigate the complex world we're in are things that need to be kind of deliberately instilled in you by your parents, and that parents who understand the importance of that particular skill give their kids a big, silent. When I meet teenagers today, I am stunned at how much more articulate and they are than when I was that age. I mean, when I was 16, I did not talk to adults. I mean, I was in my own little insular world. Now, like 16-year-olds talk to me like they're, we've been hanging out for our whole lives. And I'm sort of stunned, but that's what you're talking about. They have this leg up now. It took me years to acquire those skills. And I feel like lots of kids today have them at some tender age.
Yeah, that's true. And what do you think? I mean, this whole 10,000 hours thing, I feel like everyone quotes this from the book. Can you explain that a little bit so people understand what that means?
Well, it was just an idea. It took on a life of its own that I wasn't entirely crazy about. But that notion was just that when you're doing something cognitively complex, trying to master a cognitively complex task, the process of mastery takes more effort and practice than you think. It's not 2 years, it's 10 years. And so the model you think about is when someone goes into medicine and they do, years of medical school, then they're a resident, then do a fellowship, and then they do, and then they do professional training on an ongoing basis over the course of their entire careers. That's actually a really accurate model for the way everything that's hard works. You cannot walk out of medical school at the age of 25 and be a skilled brain surgeon. It didn't work that way. Yeah. And no one in the world of brain surgery thinks that could ever be the case. And when they look at worlds where we assume that's the case, they're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like, no one has ever been a successful point guard in the NBA who hadn't been playing point guard for 10 years. Like, this doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Like, just so all I was trying to do was just to impress upon us the idea that, so when you're judging whether someone's good or not at something, you got to give them time.
Yeah.
You can't, I don't know what can be said about a 21-year-old or 22-year-old or even a 25-year-old in almost any setting. You don't know anything yet.
Yeah.
They haven't put in nearly enough time for us to be able to assess how good they are at a given task.
Yeah. And that's such an important point, because people compare their behind the scenes messiness to other people's highlight reel. And they don't realize that Serena Williams is like waking up at 4 a.m. hitting those balls like all day long. Like they're putting in that time. Okay. So moving along. So one of the most important things that you talk about in David and Goliath is how adversity and setbacks can actually turn into something that is purposeful, that is so important. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was just an expansion of the Outliers book, because I was just saying, you know what? It's not just the case that the advantages, that it's only obvious advantages that put us ahead. It's also the case that sometimes disadvantages can be advantageous. That sometimes the process of coping with the way, with your flaws or your weaknesses can be a much more valuable learning experience than simply capitalizing on your strengths. And that's a kind of more, I wanted to sort of complexify the argument in Outliers. So that book was really started because I kept on meeting incredibly successful business people who were dyslexic. And I met so many of them. So then I went back and I began to I interviewed like 25 highly successful entrepreneurs who were dyslexic. And every single one of them said exactly the same thing, which is, I am not successful in business in spite of my dyslexia. I am successful because of it. That the process of compensating for, if you can't read, you have to work so hard at everything else that you end up further ahead.
Yeah.
Right? Now, that is if you're good at it. It is also the case that lots of dyslexic people are defeated by, prisons are full of people with dyslexia. Like, it's a high risk strategy, but those who succeed at it are ahead of the game. That was, by the 25th time you've heard that argument from someone who has started some massive business or someone who's been some insane success in their life, you begin to take it seriously. And that's where that book came from.
That's amazing. I didn't realize I didn't know all of those details, but it's so powerful. And my father, he's deaf and he's a psychologist. And I know that he chose that because he had a lot of empathy for people who were struggling. And he also had something to prove. Like, he wanted to prove he could spend his life listening. And so he can't hear and he reads lips. And I'm like, why choose something so hard? And it's like, it was like, because of it, it's really, really interesting.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. You are fascinating. If you look up fascinating in the dictionary, it's just you. It's like pages about you. Last question about your books, as if like we really need 25 hours. So Talking to Strangers, such an important book, especially for now. Every single person hopefully has it. If you haven't, you should be reading it. What is the thing that we should take away when talking to people, when we want those interactions to be successful, when we want to avoid pitfalls? What should we know? What should we think about in interacting with people that makes it work?
We should be aware of how hard it is to successfully interpret someone by looking at observing their body language, facial expressions, affect. And we should, as a result, be really cautious in how we evaluate people. As human beings, we make so many mistakes in reading other people's emotions that at a certain point you have to say to yourself, you know what? Stop. If I'm talking to you, Kathy, I've never met you before, and you seem a certain way, I need to stop before and evaluate that assumption. Like, if you seemed in this conversation to be distracted, one interpretation is you don't like me. Another interpretation is something horrible happened to you this morning, or your partner's in the hospital, or I don't know, your dog's dying. I mean, I could come up with I don't know what it means. Or you could be yawning and I assume it's because you're bored, and maybe it's because you got 2 hours of sleep last night because, your baby was screaming. I don't know. Like, there's just so many. Or you could look, distracted and be humming, but maybe that's just the way you focus, right? I'm someone who hums a huge amount, and everyone always assumes I'm humming because I'm bored. No, I'm humming. I hum when I'm hearing something that pleases me. Going back to my father again, my dad was a hummer. He and I would go out for long walks and we would just hum because we were happy. We weren't bored with each other's company. So if I start humming in this conversation, you'll know, but you only know that because I told you, right? If you were meeting me cold, you'd say, what is going on with Gladwell? Like, is he checked out? No, Gladwell's not checked out. I like to have theme music to my interest level.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. I feel like what it really is about is like making space for people, like actually showing up and listening. And in this world, everything's so quick. And I had Brian Grazer on the show, and I imagine are friends. And I was crying hearing him say, he goes, Kathy, all of my success is one thing: having conversations with people where there's no agenda. Like, I'm literally like, who can I meet this week and sit down with an astronaut and just be like, tell me everything. Like, what do you feel? Really? That's what you feel? I wouldn't have known that. That's what you love? Let's make a movie about this. Like, he was like, people don't have conversations. Like, he's like, I was a nothing. I was like a 24-year-old kid. I walked into Ron Howard's office. I'm like, hey, tell me what you love. Tell me who you are. And people want to be seen so badly. And I read this book and I looked at his book and I looked at it and I was like, this is so unique. Unfortunately, it's so rare that people are saying, please just stop. Go into beginner's mind and just make space for someone.
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying. And no one's doing that. Why don't we do that? Is it because we want to like save time? Is it because it's easier in the brain to like categorize people? Why are we, and why can't we just do what you're saying to do? Why is that so hard?
No, I mean, I think we erect a lot of unnecessary, or we create a lot of unnecessary deadlines for evaluation. So why do I have to have an opinion of you by the end of this conversation? I don't actually. I don't have to I don't have to decide whether I like you or dislike you. What if, maybe I should wait until the 5th time we've had a conversation. There's no reason not to, right? So I feel like it's my big quarrel with, in a job interview, you evaluate someone in 45 minutes, but that's really just because you can't spend 7 hours, right? It's just you got to get on with your life. You got to so we create this deadline. I got to make a decision after 2 interviews and hour and a half total. But to understand, that's not because we actually think we can make a good conclusion about you after 45 minutes. It's because we have to, right? And if we don't have to, then don't. Take your sweet time. That's a lot of it. But also, I think we get a certain satisfaction in kind of checking the box. Oh, so-and-so is, that person's a jerk, right? Then you can sort of move on. And I think you have to kind of fight that impulse.
Yeah. I don't know how you have the bandwidth or the time to do as much as you do, but you created this incredible podcast, which is so fun to listen to. And it's so interesting. And there's a new season, which everyone should listen to. So what made you want to do this? Like, what made you want to do this particular show, Revisionist History?
Well, my best friend, Jacob, was running an audio company. He told me that I should do a podcast, and I had never thought about it before. So I was like, why not? Sounds like fun. Thinking it would be 2 months and then I would never do another one. Right. But then I sort of fell in love with it. And I decided to call it Revisionist History. And the tagline is, we look at things that are overlooked or misunderstood. But basically that's just an excuse for talking about whatever I want to talk about. There's no,
I got that. Yeah.
The shows are all over the map. They're just like, in this season, I have an episode where it's half about the 9/11 memorial and half about this group in Jacksonville, Florida, that deals with the homeless. It sounds really, really random when I described it to you. I think it works. But I have another episode, it ran already, which is all about this guy, an American, who goes to Bolivia and tries to convince high schools there to choose their student councils by lottery, not by election, on what he learns. So they're all it's just stuff, every December or whatever, I start thinking about, what weird things have I encountered over the previous 6 months that would be fun to explore. And so I've now done 5 seasons of Revisionist History, and it's all that. It's just weird stuff Malcolm thinks about and is obsessed with and wants to know more about. And then the reader or the listener and I go on the journey, right? We it's been insanely fun. I mean, it's the most fun thing I've done in forever.
That's the word I use to describe it. It's so fun to listen to you, and it's so fun to listen to you having fun. And you're really such a natural star. Like, I love hearing you. Like, it's fun to read your books because they're so juicy, but listening to you playing is like in and of itself just like such a Willy Wonka chocolate factory experience. And then you must have loved podcasting so much because you created Pushkin, like you have your whole network. What made you want to do that? You have so much to do. What made you, what is it about podcasting and that experience that you were like, I want other people to have this experience and I want to have a whole thing?
Well, Jacob approached me again and said, should we set up our own shop? I tend to just do what Jacob says.
I got that.
But it was something I'd never done. So I've been a writer as a solitary person who works alone, and then when they're done, they hand it over to someone else, and then that's it. And with podcasting, for the first time in my life, I'd worked with a team when I started Revisionist History, and I really liked that. I'd never done that. It was like really, and then I thought, well, the ultimate expression of creating teams is starting a company. And what happens when you start a company? Well, you go out and you just hire people you want to work with.
Yeah.
And that just struck me as being such an insanely cool idea. And starting something from scratch with my best friend and just hiring, we collected this kind of little community of, and I mean this in the best possible way, weirdos. I'm one of them. Quirky, kind of interesting people. And I said, like, let's just all get together and like do our own little weird, quirky thing and like have it be a non-corporate fun. And we have our statement of, we did our little statement of principles. And one really, really high up is like, we should be having fun. And if we're not having fun, we're wasting our time. Like, the point of this is to enjoy ourselves and hopefully make enough so we can, pay the bills. But we don't ever want to be in a situation where it's drudgery. And so far it's been super fun. I'm having a meeting, a kind of COVID-friendly meeting at my house upstate on Thursday for this team. We're working on an audiobook that comes out of Revisionist History. And, we could just have a phone call, but like, it wouldn't be fun.
Yeah. We're
going to sit at a table in my backyard and we're going to like blue sky about this really cool thing I'm doing. It's like, we're doing. And I'm looking forward to that. That's going to make my week.
That's awesome. When you're all of these things, when you're writing, when you're podcasting, you're such a storyteller. You're so good at that. What's your advice to people who would love to have 1/2 of 1 ounce of your success in writing and telling stories and podcasting? What do you think makes that work?
Well, we're all storytellers. I mean, 90% of people can tell a good story. The problem starts though when people are asked to tell a story in something other than conversational mode. So, I don't know a single friend of mine who can't crack me up with some tale from their life. But for some reason, if I ask them to write it down, or I ask them to perform it, they can't do it in the same way. Yeah. And to my mind, then the problem is solving that issue. What has to happen for someone to translate the same success they have in casual conversation to some more formal setting? And I think this is especially true of kids. You can sit down with an 8-year-old and they can tell you, they can read a book and they can tell you why they love the book. But then when you ask them to write a book report, you'd think that they hadn't read the book or they didn't like the book or so it's about bridging that gap. And some of that is about practice. You just have to, some of it is about understanding that telling a story in a more formal setting is not different. It's the same process. So to the 8-year-old or the 10-year-old who's writing a book report, what I always say is, you just tell me the story the way you told. Like, writing is not some totally weird, specialized thing over in the corner. It is just the written version of what you have been telling me face to face for the last 10 minutes. Yeah. In fact, I always think one day I would love to teach a writing class to kids, and I would make every kid tape themselves telling the story and then transcribe the tape.
Yeah.
And that's where we start.
Oh.
Right? And then just clean up the transcription and then see where we are. And then talk about, well, how will we make it better?
Yeah.
Like, or where did people laugh? So did you want them to laugh there? Or is there a way for us to make them laugh even harder?
Yeah.
Right? But work convince them that they already have what it takes. They're just putting up these barriers to performing in another genre.
It's so great what you just said. I think people are going to get so much from that. When Seth Godin was here, he said, people get writer's block, but people don't get talker's block. Like,
yeah, exactly right.
Just talk, just speak it out. And he also said, he goes, 50% of my blog is below average because that's what average means. Like, just practice, just keep doing it, right? It's kind of like what you just said as well. I think part of the problem that comes up, and as we're summing up, this is one of the main pain points for my audience, is it's already been done. There's no room for me. I'm an imposter. These people are better. Why would I write a book? Why would I say a podcast? What do you think about that phenomenon?
Yeah.
Everyone I meet struggles with that.
I had a friend when I was just starting out as a writer, and I was in my early 20s, and she was very, very intelligent, and she had read everything, and she would say that to me. And I remember in the beginning, she discouraged me, and finally I realized that she was wrong. And it actually, I'm sad to say, the friendship did not survive this, because I realized I can't be who I want to be with that voice in my head.
Yeah.
That is the single most destructive thing you can say. And it's profoundly not true, because what people forget is the story you're telling me had been told before, but it wasn't told by you. That the fact that you're telling it makes it different. So think about how many different conversations. I was obsessed with this Netflix show called Jiri Haji, and made all my friends watch Jiri Haji. So I've now had conversations about Jiri Haji with 10 different people. We're talking about this. All of us are talking about the exact same television show, right? Why do I keep having conversations with Jiri Haji then about Jiri Haji? Because every conversation is different. Because every person is because there's so much there. No one ever says, oh, Malcolm, I don't want to talk to you about my feelings about Jiri Haji because I know you've already had 8 conversations with 8 other friends about Jiri Haji. No one says that, because they understand, oh, no. Malcolm wants to know what I think about it. And my take is going to be different. So why don't you have that same confidence about everything? It's one of the reasons why I like reading. I try really hard to read things by people who I disagree with. Because it's really, really important and interesting to learn what some random person who you wouldn't ordinarily talk to is saying, even if you disagree with everything they say. It's just really valuable to figure out, oh, that's what that person thinks. And like on some percentage of occasions, when someone gives you their idiosyncratic version of a common story, you gain some really, really important insight into that person. Something about their own personality or history or interests causes them to have absorbed something in a different way.
Yeah. And
all of a sudden I have insight. I was like, oh, Kathy's different from me in this, suddenly I see you in a new light. And that's the magic in friendship, is when we can find a new way to appreciate the people around us.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And that's going to help people so much to look at it through those lenses. You're so generous. Like, you're just like, I'm here for it. And you have so many sweet, beautiful things to say. It's just all kind of like delightful. It's really a blessing. Tell us where we can follow you and find you and listen to your podcast and just be around you.
Well, I am. The only thing that matters is my podcast, Revisionist History, easily found wherever you get your podcasts. Twitter is dumb. I wouldn't recommend anyone follow me on Twitter.
Twitter is dumb.
I do tweet from time to time, but largely about track and field and not much else. I think, and all the other Pushkin podcasts, we're very excited about them, but I have a particular warm place in my heart for revisionist history.
Well, I can see why you do, and we'll obviously put links to it and we'll share it, and people are going to love it. I heard that what's cool about podcast listeners is when they already listen to podcasts, they listen to more podcasts. So
yes.
Hopefully they'll just keep adding you to the queue.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here and being you.
Thank
You're
you,
awesome.
Kathy. You too.
Okay.
You were you too.
Have the best day.
I will. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, Malcolm.